Hello, how you guys doing? I hope you're doing well. Hey, we're going to take a look at our next history lesson. We're looking at the parent generation of the modern world. Now, that's a term I'm using to describe the people who are going to be the decision makers that end up creating the world that we live in. A lot of people view the beginning of the modern era with 1914. 1914 is World War One. World War One did not just magically appear. Things happened leading up to World War One, and so we're going to take a look at those things. We looked at the events of the 1860s and the 1870s, just as a brief overview. And again, this is going to be a brief overview as well. We're not going to go into every why and wherefore. I just want you to get a feel for what's going on during this time period of the 1880s through 1895. Now, you know, the parent, so to speak, is searching and finding a way. I remember as a young adult, that's where I was. I was searching and finding a way through the world I was living in, and I didn't quite understand everything that was going on, but I was trying to make an impact on the world. And the people, usually your political leaders in the world, tend to be older. I mean, look at our president of the United States. Right now we have Donald Trump. He's in his 70s. The next president's going to be Joe Biden. He's in his 70s. Most of your presidents tend to be older. But they were once young men. And so we're going to take a look at the decision makers' background, for lack of a better way of saying it. All right, so let's go ahead and look. We already looked at the 1860s and 70s. And in the United States, you had the Angell Treaty of 1880. It basically restricted Chinese people from entering the United States. A lot of Chinese came to the United States due to the construction of the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. But after the railroad was done, many Americans did not want more Chinese immigrants coming over, especially on the West Coast. And so Chinese immigrants would be excluded from coming to the United States for 10 years, starting in 1882, because of this treaty that was signed in 1880. 1881, the Tsar Liberator is assassinated. Alexander II. Alexander II freed the serfs of Russia in 1861. Now, 1861, Russia still had feudalism. And he put himself squarely in the middle of a major conflict in Russia. You had one side that wanted to race Russia to the future, and you had another side that wanted to pull Russia back to the past. And here is the Tsar, and he's trying to be a moderate. He's trying to gradually change Russia without destroying Russia. He would be assassinated on March 13th, 1881. And one of the things that actually led to his death, I find his death to be a great story of compassion. So he had been given by France a bomb-proof horse carriage. Now, these were very rare, especially in the 1880s, but he had one. And he was going through the streets of the capital of Russia. At that time, it was St. Petersburg. Today, the capital is Moscow, but at that time, it was St. Petersburg. And he's going through the streets, and an extremist comes out and they have a box bomb. It's basically a homemade bomb in the shape of a box, and it has a fuse. And this terrorist throws the bomb underneath the horse carriage, thinking it's going to kill Tsar Liberator, or Tsar Alexander II. The bomb does blow up. However, his driver, who is outside the carriage, is killed. His horse is killed, but he survives the blast. Also, the person who threw the bomb underneath his carriage is severely injured. And instead of being hateful towards him, he decides to be compassionate. And he gets out of the carriage and he goes down to hold the hand of the man who had just thrown a bomb at him and help him. Well, what he did not know was there was a second backup bomber. And so the second backup bomber, when he gets out of the carriage to help him, comes and throws a bomb at him. And this one would be the one that would eventually kill him. He would suffer for a couple of days, but on March 13th, 1881, he would die and succumb to the injuries from this second explosion. Talking about assassinations, we have one here in 1881, and a lot of people refer to this assassination as the forgotten assassination. James Garfield is shot by Charles Guiteau because he had rejected him for a position in the Garfield administration. The president would die 80 days after he was shot. And you can watch more about that in the video that I've linked to this. He would be replaced by Chester Arthur. And Chester Arthur, when he came to office, a lot of people really did not like Chester Arthur. But when he retired, he became more and more popular. And generally, by the time his death rolls around, he's remembered as a pretty decent president. Not a great president, but just a decent president. However, I'm going to throw this out here. There's a little bit of controversy with Chester Arthur. Where was he born? You know, some people think he was born in Canada, which would have made him unconstitutionally the president, because he should not have been born in another country and a citizen of another country. But some people think he was born 15 miles across the Vermont border in Quebec. It's very interesting. It's a long, interesting story. Maybe if you want to study more about that, you can. 1882, Britain takes over Egypt in response to anti-foreign riots. Now, that's what they said they went in there for. But the truth be told, it was more about securing the Suez Canal and the Nile River for their imperialistic goals. Remember, the crown jewel of the British Empire was India. And so Egypt, having control of the Suez Canal, the British needed the Suez Canal to get to India. In 1882, the Triple Alliance is struck between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, Italy would eventually back out, but the Ottoman Empire would join, and those three countries, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, would be the central powers of 1914 when we get to World War I. 1883, in response to the Garfield assassination, the Pendleton Act was passed. Now, there's a lot with it, and we can get really, really, really complicated, but there's basically two things I want you to understand. Before the Pendleton Act, the president just basically chose anybody to do government jobs. This was called the spoils system, and it was established by Andrew Jackson, and it came from the quote, "To the victor goes the spoils," which is actually a quote from a Roman emperor. But long story short, in the Pendleton Act, we adopted a civil service exam. So instead of choosing people based on who they knew, we chose people for government jobs based on what they know. And that's a major change. The Pendleton Act established the Civil Service Commission, and so no longer what was your government job chosen by your political affiliation. It was chosen by your capability to do the job. The reason this was pushed through was because that's why James Garfield was assassinated. A guy wanted a job, he didn't give him one, he got shot. 1883, the United States Navy becomes modern. You know, we still had most of our Navy before 1883 with wooden hulled ships. But on March 3rd, the United States approves the construction of 3 steel cruisers. And this is the beginning of the modern warship. And in the next 17 years, the U.S. Navy would go from 12th to 3rd in size. And this had to happen for the United States to become a global power. And by 1898, when we get to the Spanish-American War with the next lesson, that's going to be very, very important. One of the most iconic things in New York City is the Brooklyn Bridge. And it connected Manhattan and Brooklyn. At its time, it was built for $16 million and cost of 26 lives. The Brooklyn Bridge is still used extensively in New York City even up until today. That bridge is almost 140 years old now. When it opened, the Brooklyn Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world. And again, it's one of the iconic things in New York City. The Belgian Congo. This is a dark spot in world history. Belgium was led by a king called King Leopold. Africans were forced to collect rubber for taxes demanded by the Belgian government. Now, if the people that could not get enough rubber or meet the quota, then cruel things were done to them. For example, hands and feet would be cut off of people. I'm not going to talk too much about it because honestly, most of it is too brutal. But you should know that it happened. And this was a effect of something called imperialism, or basically the desire of European countries to have colonies all over the world and control the world. Part of this imperialism also included Germany getting a colony in Africa called Tanzania. The East African Company was given a charter to administer Tanzania. The same year, Germany claimed the southwest of Africa and a place called Togoland. Today, we would call that Mozambique. 1889. Boomer Sooner, baby. I'm going to go ahead and read this. You guys can read it as well. The last major unsettled territory in the United States, which had been exclusively Native American, was open for settlement. Over 200,000 settlers waited at the border of what was before called Indian Territory, awaiting settlement. On the first day the territory was opened, 12,000 settlers arrived in Guthrie, Oklahoma. With the opening of the first transcontinental railroad, thousands of settlers were streaming west. And in 1879, a number of prominent citizens, newspapers, and railroads began publicly campaigning to open the unassigned lands to settlement. These pro-settlement forces were known as boomers. The boomers carried out raids in the area to survey for future towns. Some went as far as planting crops and building houses. These raids were done against the Native Americans who were living there. For a decade, the government resisted even sending in troops against the boomers. Finally, in March of 1889, the Springer Amendment to the Indian Appropriation Act of 1889 officially authorized settlement of Oklahoma. However, instead of honoring the squatters' rights of the boomers, the land was settled by a land run on April 22nd, 1889. Well, you were supposed to wait till April 22nd. People didn't, okay? Instead, people began illegally staking out land before the run. A section of the legislation referred to these as the Sooner Clause prohibited this practice, staking a claim too soon. So those who persisted became known as Sooners because they were there too soon. Some Sooners sneaked onto the claims the night before the run. Once the run had started, they would suddenly appear, having seemingly beat legitimate settlers. Naturally, this led to many disputes, and the term Sooner had a negative connotation for years, especially in Oklahoma. However, the word lost its unfavorable association, and by 1908, the University of Oklahoma has a football team, and they adopt the nickname Sooners. And later, Oklahoma became known as the Sooner State, and that is the state motto of Oklahoma even today. Tens of thousands of settlers, many of them immigrants, came to Oklahoma for the land run. Cities literally sprang up overnight at noon, April 22nd, 1889. At the many points of the entry surrounding the claims, military officers fired pistols and rifles into the air, and that began the land run across the border into what is today the state of Oklahoma. An estimated 50,000 vied to stake their claim on the 160 acres of free land. That's what you got. Boomers and Sooners alike became known as the 89ers. The 89ers. Also in 1889, you had in Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the entire town was wiped off the map. Now, Johnstown has since rebuilt, but they had an earthen dam built. And during an intense rainstorm, the pressure behind the dam gave way. The dam literally gave way. And a 60-foot wall of water flowed through Johnstown. If you look at Johnstown today, you can see it is built in a valley. Now, I want you to imagine that entire valley all of a sudden going from what you're seeing right there today to having a 60-foot wall of water rush through that valley. That's what happened at Johnstown. Over 2,000 people lost their lives that day. It is still one of the biggest catastrophes in world history and U.S. history. Otto von Bismarck is going to resign. He was the chancellor of the new German Republic that established in 1871. He was responsible for unifying Germany, and he was also responsible for the global diplomacy that set the stage for World War I. While he was chancellor, he knew how to work the alliances, obviously in Germany's favor, but also how to use them to prevent war. However, after he steps down, the new leaders do not know how to use his system that he brought into the forefront. Everything was done in secret, and so there was not much else that could be done. And this is going to be one of the ground laying events that starts to lead towards World War I in 1914. Vincent van Gogh, he dies July 29th, 1890, and today he's known as one of the best painters of all time, but not when he died. When he died, he only had sold one painting. But he was famous for an artistic style known as Impressionism. And this artistic style was both visual and auditory. This movement of Impressionism focused on blending boundaries together. Okay. Other famous Impressionist painters were Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, and Claude Monet, and Edvard Munch. You can look down at the bottom. Edvard Munch is famous for that painting Scream, and you can see, even though you can clearly see what the painting is, all the things blend together. Okay, everything's just blending together. Look at the hay field there with Claude Monet, and even though it's clear, everything's just blending together. Instead of practicing realism, trying to get it as realistic as possible, what they began painting during the Impressionist era was almost like a whimsical dream, where everything's just kind of fuzzy, and it's this look on the past and this feel of the future racing towards you. Now I'm going to put two links on. One of them is Bolero by Ravel, and the other one is Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. And you're going to listen to those on Friday. That's going to be your Friday assignment. And what I want you to do when you do that on Friday is just tell me the feel of the music and be able to discuss that the next time we have class together. All right, 1892, Ellis Island opens, and this becomes the official entryway for many Eastern Europeans to come into our country. Today, Ellis Island is one of the most famous sites that people flock to visit in New York City. 1893, we have another depression. So we had one in 1873. Now we have one in 1893. There was a credit shortage, and it created a panic leading to a depression. Over 15,000 businesses, 600 banks, and 74 railroads failed. The railroad at that time was the linchpin, so to speak, of American industry. So when American industry started falling apart, so did the railroads. There was severe unemployment and wide-scale protesting, which in some cases became very violent. Now, I'm going to talk about Hawaii here in a second. That happened in 1893 as well. But I'm going to go ahead and skip to 1894 for a second. This depression would lead to the Pullman rail strike. It was led by Eugene Debs, and it was directed against the Pullman Rail Company after the company responded to the depression by cutting workers' salaries in half. But they refused to cut their rent payments in Pullman houses. See, these rail companies not only owned the railroads, they often owned the homes that their workers were living in. And so they could control how much they got. So they cut their salary in half, but they kept the rent of their homes the same. Well, this led to a strike that basically shut down the Pullman Rail Company. Let's go back to 1893, and Hawaii is an independent country until 1893. But in the years leading up to 1893, a lot of American Farmers had gone to Hawaii to grow sugar and pineapple. American sugar growers revolted against the native Hawaiian monarch, and the revolt received assistance from the Marines. The new government received American recognition, and a treaty was drawn up to annex the Hawaiian Islands, but did not pass before President Harrison left office, and McKinley would adopt troops. By 1901, James Dole, cousin of Sanford Dole, incorporated the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. He became known as the Pineapple King. And that is why when you go to the grocery store, you will see Dole pineapples everywhere. Little side note, it's almost impossible to own land in Hawaii. Almost everything is owned, technically, by the Dole Company. A lot of people do not know that. 1895. Now, if you remember the Meiji Restoration of 1881, from 1871, from before in our last PowerPoint, Japan from that point began industrializing. China had not. Now, anytime you see the word part Sino means Chinese. Okay, I had corrected this. This should say the first Sino-Japanese War, and every time I fix this, it goes back to Chinese. It is the first Sino-Japanese War, and that tells who fought in the war: China and Japan. The Chinese Army and Navy were soundly defeated by the Japanese, who had modern fighting weapons where the Chinese did not. The Chinese were still fighting their Navy with their old traditional boats that at one time they were the best in the world. They were called junks, but in this war they were soundly defeated by steel-hulled boats created by the Japanese. And of course, when they blew up a Chinese ship, the pieces of the ship literally became pieces of junk. And that's where the terminology comes from, because the boats were now antiquated. But at one time, junks were the best boats in the world, just letting you know. The war ended with a treaty, and under the terms of this treaty, Taiwan, some islands, and were ceded to Japan, and Korea was recognized as an independent country from China, which Japan would take advantage of in 1908. We'll talk about that in the next PowerPoint. Also, China had to pay war reparations to Japan. All right, so I want you to think about the war. Imagine being 13 in 1860. By 1895, you're 48 years old. What kind of changes did you see? Pause the video and think about that. Okay, we're back. Now, imagine being 13 in 1880. Now, you're 28 by 1895. What view of the world do you have? Pause the video and think about that. All right, now imagine you are 13 years old in 1895. What view do you have of the world that's different than the two groups before? I want you to think about that, because this generation gap, this concept is really quite prevalent even up until today. What your parents grew up with and what you grew up with are literally two different worlds. And that generation gap began really appearing after 1860. Okay, before 1860 it existed, but not to this level. The Industrial Revolution and the modern world that we know of basically created a generation gap. I want you to be thinking about that. All right, you guys did a good job today, and I'm very proud of you. And I want you guys to have a wonderful day.